Good morning, everyone. As Esther probably told you, because I don't speak Spanish, I'm going to present on behalf of the Cypriot Town Planning and Housing Department. And it's a good practice, but on a policy level. You will not see individual buildings, you will not see a specific case, but you will see what is happening in order to preserve cultural heritage in Cyprus. There are various incentives, but this was deemed the most appropriate, as it has the majority of the buildings under this law. Just a brief description of what we are going to see today. Introduction about what is happening in Cyprus in the terms of cultural heritage and listed buildings. We are going to talk about the listed buildings incentives framework, the criteria for financial incentives, the analysis of the financial incentives, the relevance for the Violet projects, and the next steps. Of course, everyone in this room knows how important is the historic built environment in both urban and rural areas, as well as the cultural landscape, since they are assets of priceless value for the area in which they are located. Overall, in Cyprus, there are more than 10,000 traditional buildings, both in towns and villages, which have been recorded by the Department of Town Planning and Housing over the years. These buildings form the part of the department's archive of historical traditional settlements, and in the recent years we have seen the first buildings of industrial complexes and of modern architecture. Cultural heritage, maybe it came a bit late in the Cyprus, so we had in 1975 the concept of the architectural conservation. A year later, the preservation acquired legal format. In 1979, the first preservation order was issued, and in 1987, the signing of the European Convention on Architectural Heritage strengthened the notion of preservation. So in 1990, we had the performance in the full capacity of the Town and Country Planning Act. We had the creation of the preservation and cultural heritage sector, and for the first time, we had a clear policy for the preservation of architectural heritage. We also had the creation of the Commissions on Aesthetic Control. Now, regarding the incentives framework, it was, from the first years, it was obvious that there was a need for financial assistance to owners in order to implement the restoration works, since it's considered to be really high. In 1987, we had the first economic incentive program, which was provided according to the provisions of law on listed buildings. This program was mainly low-interested loans for families with low incomes because it was considered important to give these families an extra push to implement restoration works. In 1992, the program was further developed and it formed a part of the Listed Buildings Act, and it included, besides the low-interest loans, direct grants, tax incentives, and the innovative approach of transfer of plot ratio. It was obvious that for the first time, everything was aiming at architectural heritage, since these incentives do not include income criteria in relation to the grant and loan. So irrespective of your income, you are allowed to get this incentive. The program was revised and updated to offer significant increase of the grant in aid and of the architectural study and supervision subsidy, which is really important to have the money to actually pay for the supervision works. And it finally excluded the provision of low-interest loans because it was too complicated. We will analyze this later, but as a first glance, the incentives are divided in three categories. Those are the financial incentives, the direct grant in aid, which is from the state with a million of about 5.5 million per year. We also have the tax deductions and the transfer of development rights, which we think is the most important because it's not something that you met in a lot of countries. The financial incentives are provided every 20 years for the complete restoration of the listed building. So even if you took into advantage the incentives 20 years ago, you can apply again in order to make sure that your building will be restored and preserved at the original state. But the financial aid is released towards the end of the restoration works in order to ensure the building's restoration. That was actually a change that happened during the implementation of the incentives, because a lot of owners were taking into advantage the incentives without actually doing stuff on their buildings. This is just for you to see how the financial state was increased per individual case. From 2004 to 2008, it's not actually an increase, but we had the euro coming in Cyprus, so it just was the adaptation of euro in the Cyprus market. So since 2008, we don't have any changes, and we don't think that we will have for the next years, as they deem from the department, these budgets deemed to be appropriate. We have seen that through these incentives, the owners started to seek classification for the traditional buildings. In the beginning of the preservation orders, it was something that it wasn't considered as good from the owners, because they couldn't take into advantage their properties. So even if in the beginning they were against the preservation order, after giving the incentives, after the department gave the incentives, we start seeing that the owners themselves start to seek the classification of their building as a listed building. In 1991, we had the first preservation order to include the classification after the owner's request. In 1999, the first preservation order included a whole rural area. And now in 2018, we have approximately 6,400 buildings declared as listed buildings, including buildings or other constructions in both urban and rural areas. The declaration of listed buildings over the last years is happening at a steady pace, around 65 to 75 buildings per year. And every year, around 350 listed buildings are under maintenance and restoration works. The total number of buildings that have finance up to date are around 3,500 cases, and we are expecting to just steadily increase. Now, the criteria for financial incentives. As any other incentive, you have to set specific criteria in order to make sure that you will have the desired results and people will not get into advantage of this incentive for the wrong results. As we said, these incentives are provided only once per 20 years, and they have to be related, proven with the maintenance of the restoration of the building. The process has to take place before the launch of the conservation or maintenance works, and the requests for ex post incentive are not valid except in exceptional cases. No incentives are given for works done in the building before it's declared as listed, so it's mandatory first to declare your building as listed, which is a separate procedure. In addition, the owners of more than one listed buildings is possible to benefit from the provided incentives as long as the buildings are in different plots. 2 or more buildings in one plot will be eligible for the incentives as 2 or more separate buildings, provided that they were originally operated separately. In the case of co-ownership, each co-owner will be eligible for the incentives, but they have to prove that the building was, the title deed and the total subsidy rate was separate from the beginning. Now, if we are going to see the analysis for each category of financial incentives, but just to have a picture of what is considered as maybe it's one part of a listed buildings. This is a restoration work of a listed building in a mountainous area of Askas village. This building was fully restored, taking into advantage the available incentives. That's just one example, just to give you a picture of what is considered traditional in the mountainous areas of Cyprus. Firstly, we have the direct grant in aid, as we said before, which is the direct sponsorship given from the state to the owner of the complete maintenance of the listed building. The amount of the subsidy is calculated for each listed building according to the cost of restoration, which is recognized by the state. We have to make clear that there are two separated prices that are taken into account when establishing the restoration cost. The first one represents the actual cost, which is the tenders provided from the building contractor. And the second one is based on the maximum cost per square meter that is determined by the state, and we will see an example afterwards. The approved cost of the restoration is always the lowest of the above prices. The maximum subsidy is up to 90,000 euros, or 40 to 50% depends on the location of the building. Maximum 4,000 euros can be given to the architect towards their fee. Now, the department considers as approved cost 1,200 euros per square meter if you have a building smaller than 120 square meters, and goes up to as low as 700 euros per square meter for built area more than 1,000 square meters. This was just to balance a bit the restoration works in accordance to the size of the building. Here is one example in rural area. You can see that the listed building area is 120 square meters. They give additionally 30% for the surrounding areas of the building, because you may have an auxiliary building, you may have landscape works. So the department recognized an additional area of 30%. So in total, this area this building has a recognized area as 156 square meters. The approved restoration cost is 1,100 euros. Therefore, we have restoration works up to 170,000 euros. The grant in aid is 85,000 euros, which is considered the amount that the owner will take. In urban areas, we have the 40% recognized as from the departments is easier to reach in an urban area. The construction works is easier to be made. So you can see that the recognized cost is up to 74,000 euros plus 4,000 euros for the architects. Now we have a different example in the urban area as well, that you can see the approved cost. It was as high as 260,000 euros. But actually, because the department cannot give a subsidy more than 90,000 euros, that was the maximum that the owner had as a grant in aid. Now, in the second category, this is again a traditional stone-built house in a village in Paphos area. It was fully restored in 2006 from, again, taking into advantage the incentives from the ministry. For the tax benefits, those are given once the listed building has been totally restored in accordance with the conservation order, and there are 4 tax deductions. The first one is the exception from taxes for the whole approved cost of restoration. We have also the exception from taxes for rents, the exception from the tax for immovable property, and the return of transfer fees from the land registry department if the building was already listed. We have also additional incentives under preconditions, which can be the incentives for tenants or listed buildings and direct interventions to support listed buildings. This is another example in a rural area that we had a restoration, taking again into advantage the incentives. It's a private residential building in the historical part of the old Nicosia city center. Now, the innovative of these incentives, it was, as we said before, the transfer of development rights. This means that the owner can sell its development rights with 2 ways. First one, we have the transfer of residential plot ratio, which means that if in the current zone you are allowed to build more, but you have a conservation order, so you cannot use this area, then you are eligible to sell this area to another owner in specific areas. which are called receiver areas and are usually commercial, touristic areas that the development is desired. We also have the transfer of provided plot ratio, which is given from the government in order to secure 50% of the maintenance costs as a help for the owner. This has to be that the listed has to be given under the condition that the listed building is needed conservation works, and it only takes place before or during the progress of the restoration works. But just to have, we have to say that these incentives operate in the free market without the intervention of the state, so it's something like a black market. We are giving one example here. You have a building that is 150 square meters, but you are allowed to build up to 300 square meters. Since you have the conservation order, you cannot use this area, so you are eligible to sell it in the receiver areas, and you sell it as much as you want. So if someone is willing to pay a lot of money, you can get the money and no one will intervene in this procedure. In this case, you can see that the restoration works are more than the available grant in aid. So the government can give to the owner a plot ratio to sell up to 10,000 euros for this case to cover the expenses that are not covered from the state. We are going to use to see an example here. The building on the right is a new development in Limassol touristic area. So it's an area that is now under major renovation. We have for the first time the high residential buildings, the high commercial buildings, the skyscrapers. So these people need to buy more plot ratio in order to have their building design as they want, and because in Cyprus it's not a common thing to have so big buildings, the initial plot ratio was low. So in the specific case, the 5 listed buildings, the owners of the 5 listed buildings on the left, sold the development rights to the building on the right. So as you can see, some buildings were took into advantage both the residential plot ratio and the provided plot ratio. So the final building on the right has an extra 3,000 square meters area to build because it bought the area from the listed buildings. This area was bought for over 1 million, and you can see the amounts on the left that each owner of the listed building took after the settlement of the plot ratio. But at the same time, the owner of the new development has to pay the special conservation fund. This fund is also used to provide the grant in aid. So in this case, this owner gave to the state 150,000 euros, and this euros is then used by the ministry, the Department of Town Planning, for other listed buildings. So the department financed the restoration of other listed buildings from this amount, and this amount is extra. It's not connected to the available budget per year. We have here 2 other examples that the initial restoration works for the first case, it was over 200,000 euros, but after making full use of the incentives, the owner only paid 70,000 euros. In the second case, you can see that the building was restoration works cost 670,000 euros, but the owner only paid 50,000 euros from this amount because it took into advantage the incentives, and it sells the development rights in a really high. You can see that he sells the development rights for 500,000, which is really important. So now we can see that we have these buildings restored and maintained by making use of these incentives. This is the relevance for the pilot project. In our case, in the framework of Violet, it was really important to give emphasis into the mobilization of financing opportunities for traditional and historical buildings. We have some incentives given by the Energy Service, and we have these incentives from the Town Planning and Housing Department. We understand that these incentives have as a main target the protection of the cultural and architectural heritage, and it's of a great importance, but unfortunately it does not directly address the energy efficiency of the buildings, which might lead to the downgrading of the energy performance. So our aim is to strengthen these incentives with additional or combinational measures from the Ministry of Energy, Commerce, Industry and Tourism, providing further motivation for the restoration of these buildings in accordance to today's standards for energy efficiency. It's noted that the Department of Town Planning and Housing is not excluding energy efficiency interventions, but they are not a priority. They might say, okay, you can put a thermal insulation on your roof, and it's suggested to do it, but you will not have an extra budget for this. Or in other cases, okay, you can use double glazing, but the approved cost is as it was initially. So a lot of owners do not proceed with these measures because they are not obliged by law for the energy efficiency, and the budget is not high enough to cover this intervention. So with Violet, we hope that we will have a new scheme aiming at to cover this gap between the two departments. The next steps of the department is they want to make the maintenance works in different phases, and the owner can get the subsidy in accordance to the how it implements the restoration works, and they want to release the immediate interventions to buildings. So if an owner deems that its house is going to be demolished or completely destroyed, then the department can release the incentive before this thing will happen. They will also include more receiver areas. So more receiver areas means that more areas will have the right to buy these development rights from the listed buildings. So we will see that at the same time we have the cultural heritage preservation, and at another part of the Cyprus Island we will have the development of new buildings and high-rise buildings, just by providing one incentive in the market. The opportunities for Violet, as Esther said before, is the new directive of the European Parliament, which encourage energy efficiency in traditional historical buildings. And for us, it was really, really important because it's the first time, even if it's not obligatory, it's just something that encourage this. It's the first time that we have in a European level putting together the energy efficiency and the cultural heritage. In addition, for Violet, our energy ambassador it works on the energy service. So in the second task force meeting on research, innovation and competitiveness on the national system of governance for energy and climate, Mr. Nikos, which is our energy ambassador, set as a priority area the energy upgrading of historic buildings and other special buildings. So it's already obvious in Cyprus that we have the first steps for these buildings to be considered as really important, not just from cultural heritage, but also as energy performance. We also have the development strategy of the mountainous area of Troodos, which for the first time they are discussing about renewable energy sources installations on a community level. And because in Cyprus we have mountainous areas that the whole community is declared as listed. So what's happening? You cannot put your systems, you cannot produce electricity, you cannot have the heating because there is no space for the electromechanical systems. So if we combine this development strategy of the Troodos Mountain and Violet project, we can hopefully we will see the first steps to create community level systems, either for photovoltaics, either for district heatings. We also have the energy service schemes, which it gives incentives for residential buildings to make intervention for energy performance and improvements. So for the first time we are discussing again how to maybe lower a bit the standards in the case of listed building or traditional building in order for these owners to be able to take into advantage these incentives as well. And lastly, after having our previous project meeting, we saw some similar cases with guidebooks on combining both the energy efficiency and historic buildings, as in the case of Romania and as in the case of UK that we had a contact. So in Cyprus, we are also discussing about having this guidebook as well, because it will give maybe a push to the professionals which are involved in this area to use these practices and have solid results as well in order to establish the full restoration with energy performance criteria. That's just food for thought. I think it's something that we all know, and that's the Cyprus case. Thank you very much.